We live in an increasingly complicated world with a public that is increasingly disinterested in complexity.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Your Daily Detroit. We are back from the holiday weekend with what to know and where to go in Southeast Michigan. It is Tuesday, September 3rd, 2024. I am Jer and Steve, and joining me on the line, as he does to start, every week up to the election, Steve Freese. If you don't know Steve, he is a freelance journalist for the New York Times, Newsweek, and many others, and writes the weekly newsletter for the Ann Arbor Observer that can be found, if you look for it, it's the A2 View. I enjoy it every week, sir. Thank you for keeping me in touch with everything. And also, hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
It's been a crazy, I thought maybe it'd be a restful weekend, and that is not the case. Jazz Fest, DeQuinder Cut, everywhere. I feel like there's no rest heading into this Tuesday.
I'm trying to think if I could list the things I did this weekend, but I mean, it was just going to this park, going to that park. Yeah. I don't know. This just kind of move from one thing to the next with my kids. I don't remember anything.
It's just a blur of children in care.
Yeah.
Well, you know, as always, we like to talk about what's happening with politics and things from a local lens. And I think we'll start, the big race with Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. Vice President Harris actually was just in town at Northwestern High School, just a couple of miles down the road from the studio. This is a active and pretty hot race, even though I think some things are looking kind of up for Kamala.
She was in Detroit. Am I mistaken, or was Tim Walz also in the state at some point recently? Or J.D. Vance was in Detroit? Was that what it was?
I don't think J.D. would be in the city proper, but somewhere near Metro Detroit. Okay. Yeah, they don't usually come through here, but I'm trying to remember the exact order of things, and I apologize on what days, because, it all becomes a blur at some point.
Well, right. What I've noticed, I'm kind of surprised by, particularly when we're talking about the Democratic ticket, is that so far as I can tell, none of the candidates or their spouses or any of these other people have been showing up in the college towns in East Lansing or Harbor. And I don't really understand that. Because I understand that they've got to rally different elements, like go to Detroit, they want to push the black vote and the union vote. I get all that. And even with the Trump side stuff going to some of the suburbs. But it strikes me as just strange that they're not running into not just very receptive, but very youthful and excited locales where they actually kind of get a twofer. If Kamala Harris comes to Ann Arbor and she rallies, I don't know where they would do it here, but whatever, she rallies somewhere, Pioneer High School, whatever it is, then you get all that energy of all of those college kids. And then all of those college kids have parents who are probably mostly in the suburbs of cities all over the country, but in our state, those college kids, and the parents, then they get to see their kids interacting in politics, and they take an interest. They see it on the Instagram and the Face Place and the Talk Tick and all the rest of it, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's missing. And I also don't see it that much in other states. I don't see them going to college campuses in North Carolina, or I don't know, did they go to a college campus in Georgia? I just think that they're missing the fact that they may already have those votes, but that enthusiasm and just the photogenic nature of those events, it seems like a gimme. It seems like they should be doing that all the time. Like they talked about Tim Walz going to high school football games, and I get that. That's a great idea for the Democrats. But the college campuses, a really big one, you get the whole state all at once by doing that.
I have a working theory off the hip, and this is because I've been in college towns during when these things happened. Our studio is technically on the Wayne State campus, although no, we are not a part of Wayne State nor affiliated.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Gaza issue. I think they're avoiding the Gaza issue. If you go on a college campus, it is going to be front and center. And you're going to have protesters, you're going to have campers, you're going to have all of that. And you know that you're going to have to face this head on, not even as like a side protest thing, but the second any students know the presidential candidates coming through their campus, the tents are going up, the signs are coming out, and it's going to be real visual. I think they just don't want to deal with it.
Well, that is a great answer. I wasn't really thinking about it. I was gonna talk about it a little bit because there has been a bunch of Gaza activism reboot on Michigan's campus since the school year started last week. That's a great point. I imagine there are ways to address it, but you stumped me. That's a pretty good answer.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that they should engage, right? Like, I don't think that's like the best thing, right? But I think that that's the strategic point. Like, let's separate out between the idea that I think we should have a good conversation about this. I wish we could. But the hierarchy of everything here, I don't know if there's really room to have this debate in the way that we might in a situation where, women's issues and all that other stuff is going to come to the fore. This is an election where it's about the basics, and any more nuanced issues are just going to get thrown to the back. And you can see how much it's about those women's issues because you saw Donald Trump make that speech about, like saying that the government's going to fund or force insurers to pay it. And I'm like, there is no way any of these insurers are going to take that without a giant check, because this is one of those where I'm like, I have no way, I cannot believe that promise in any way, shape, or form, just from a practical policy point of view.
This is the amusing part of any Trump campaign. It's happened over and over again. Donald Trump just kind of comes up with something off the top of his head, and then it's almost like the news media itself, because he is the former president, could be the next president. He's making what seems like a substantive, if not very likely, policy suggestion. Then the rest of the world has to go and take his middle of the night idea and turn it into some sort of policy and look at what would it cost and how would it happen and how would it get through the Congress and what are the politics of it. And everybody has to do this because this man just, I don't know, had a moment and said, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to give this away. Of course, it makes no sense. And the thing I'm finding about the Trump campaign is that everything seems so extreme. Everything they say right now is so off the wall. I mean, they're pushing around memes that basically say that if Kamala Harris is elected, World War III, flag burning terrorists in your neighborhood. Talk about nuance. There is no nuance in the Trump campaign. It's all fear mongering to the most extreme level. And my sense is people just aren't buying it anymore.
I mean, I think you're right, but I also think that there's a lot of people at this stage of the election game are pretty locked in. I mean, that universe of out there, undecided voters is pretty small. And it's almost like, and I've talked to a few listeners about this where it's like, okay, can we just get through to this already? You were talking about Trump and saying things. I thought it was interesting. And you did send this over to me, and I want to credit you for this because there's this story I think is interesting about the University Board of Regents member Ron Weiser, who, if people don't know, is a very important figure traditionally in the GOP, and he did not win the party's nomination for the general election for the Board of Regents. And looking at university stuff may seem a little bit on the edge, but between that and the issues at their convention, I feel like, this is the complete final Trumpification of the Republican Party. Like, this is just it. I think anybody who is more of that wiser kind of wing of the party needs to go find a new home, because it is not going to be the Republicans. It shows kind of the disorganization of everything that's going on here, which we'll get into a topic later, because we're going to talk about Mike Rogers and Alyssa Slotkin a little bit more, because there's new developments. But these are the kind of look small stories that I think are indicators of bigger things. What do you think, Steve?
I think we should probably set the table a little bit, because the way that what happened with the Regents candidates, I didn't know this was how it's done, so I was surprised. For whatever reason, they didn't have a primary for it. Instead, each party, the Democrats and the Republicans, had conventions at which they nominated two candidates for the two seats that are up for election for the University of Michigan's Board of Regents, which is statewide. And what fascinated me about both cases was that both cases highlighted in a very, very stark way exactly what the internal problems are for both parties. So on the Republican side, you have Ron Weiser, who's a millionaire, mega donor to the university, a prominent, I believe, a prominent Jewish activist as well. The extent to which Ron Weiser has been involved with the growth and development of the Michigan campus in the last 5 or 6 years is really significant. He bought a whole huge mess of properties, assembled them, and then sold them at cost to the university, because for whatever reason, if he didn't do it that way, it would have taken much longer, and they needed all this land for new dorms and whatever else. He's practically, more than a regent, and yet he also was one of the figures in the Republican Party who really pushed hard to get Christina Caramo out of the chairmanship of the party. Christina Caramo is a radical right wing. I don't even know if you call it right wing, because where she stands doesn't even fit on the spectrum. She was the chairwoman of the Republican Party in the state, and that was like seen as the complete capitulation to the MAGA wing of the party. And then she got into some trouble herself, where there were accusations of mismanaging money, and so ultimately she got drummed out, and she got drummed out by folks like Ron Weiser. So they go to the convention, and he is an incumbent member of the Board of Regents of Michigan. And however the formula works for voting, it was the party activists who show up at these conventions who voted, and they decided not to renominate him. He's out of office because his own party didn't want him anymore. And yes, that is absolutely another milestone for the complete Trumpification of the Republican Party, and this question of where Republicans in the state go who aren't completely crazy. So there's that. On the Democratic side, they had a case where they had 3 candidates, and one of them was a late entry to the deal. She's a Palestinian American civil rights lawyer, and she was being pushed by student protesters and pro-Palestinian forces around the Dearborn and these parts of our state. And she actually technically got the most votes, but some formula, the way that Democrats do it for their convention, where she got the most votes, but they weight the votes based on geographic things, and I don't really understand it, and they won't say what exactly the formula is, which doesn't do them any favors. And suddenly she didn't get this nomination. So she came in third, even though she got the most votes. And it was clear that the Democratic Party was not comfortable with pushing a pro-Palestinian activist into one of their statewide races. And so that is the tension, the very, very significant tension on the left, is, like you were just saying, this issue of Palestine and Gaza and how the party handles it. And the party doesn't want to handle it. The party wants it to go away because they don't have an answer. They can't go too strong in favor of the Palestinians, because then the Jewish base will feel uncomfortable with that, and they can't afford that. And it's sort of this rock and a hard place situation, as you were saying, nationally. It also plays out within the state. It's a regents race, but in both cases, the vulnerabilities of each party just came into stark contrast.
Those regents races, it's something where the connected, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but it's the kind of thing where it's so far down the ballot, lots of people do not think about it. And so a lot of times you get names in there that are either good donors or have done things for the party. And it's part of the reason why it's a little bit more of a niche thing. You know what I mean? Like, it just doesn't get as much attention. And so therefore it's kind of I don't want to say it's always this way, but it is in a way a spoils position.
Sure. But just think about this for a second, okay? We have a presidential race and we have a Senate race. And if we had a Palestinian activist running for the Democratic Party for a college regents race, it would have gotten a lot more attention than a typical regents race would normally get. We certainly wouldn't be talking about it if that hadn't been something that all happened.
The party could also say that they would be throwing a bone to that side as well and saying, look, we can't deal with this at the top level right now, but we understand what you're saying. Here you go. Like, you know what I mean? Like, include people into the coalition.
Well, they didn't.
Nope, not at all. So, yeah, there will be a lot of younger voters, especially, like, very frustrated about this. It's an issue that's, important to a number of people, although it isn't a very difficult thing to, in actuality, figure out. This is like one of the most sticky wickets of all of global politics history.
Right now, you sit there, you listen to Americans who take what just happened, the murder and discovery of the bodies of 6 hostages, including 1 American, that Hamas had taken on October 7th. And from the American lens, everybody's online putting it into the American right-left political formula. But in Israel, the public in general is really pissed that the prime minister didn't make a deal months ago to get this done. And it's not necessarily a right-left story there. The American version of Israeli politics is very different than the Israeli version of Israeli politics.
So another race I want to take a look at, there was a recent poll in the Detroit Free Press. It's always good to see a poll, although I'm not a poll chaser per se. But Alyssa Slotkin is leading Rep. Mike Rogers 46-42 with 12% undecided. This is a race that's going to get a bit more polling attention as we get closer to the finish line here. It's interesting to see that undecided vote. It's interesting to see some of the reaction to some of the things that we talked about last week. How do you kind of see the frame now, Steve?
One of the things I thought was interesting, one of the reasons I wanted to come back to this conversation is because last week I was talking about how neither candidate wants to be identified with their own party, and that Mike Rogers is sending mailers that don't say anything about being a Republican. And I don't know, I haven't gotten any mailers or haven't seen mailers that Alyssa Slotkin has put out there, but I did notice more recently that I think there are sort of 2 faces of the Mike Rogers campaign. There's the face of the Mike Rogers campaign that wants to be seen as super independent and puts out these mailers that says that he took on both parties and he disagreed with both presidents and whatever else he might want to say for the purposes of the people who he has made these things to. And I guess because I'm in a place like Washtenaw County, I would get this sort of mailer. But then I go online and there's tons of digital ads of him with Trump in the picture. Like, he's doing the Trump backs him sort of thing online, theoretically, I guess, trying to be more strategic about it. I don't know if Alyssa Slotkin is trying to split that the same way.
I don't think she's trying to split it as much because, she has appeared at rallies. She will show up with Governor Gretchen Whitmer. She will take, like, direct shots at J.D. Vance online.
She did?
Oh, yeah, like straight out, like right about, like, this is how you have a normal interaction at a bakery. Like, she goes straight at them. That's where I'll push back a little bit on what you said last week. Like, I think she's just more confident in her party side. It's interesting what you say about the mailers, because I will never get a Republican mailer where I live, right? That'll never happen. Or at least one that isn't from an influencer group. Because where I am, most people think by zip code, and statistically they'd be correct, this is a super majority black area. The only kind of Republican mailers I'm going to get is something like Blacks for Trump. But online and for digital, you're absolutely right in that you see Trump and Rogers like right together. I'm seeing on the digital ads a lot of sheriff stuff where like just making up this stuff that just seems a little completely implausible as far as Alyssa Slotkin goes about like where she's funneling money to. It's all anger. And that's the thing is that and I noticed this with the vice president ads, with the senatorial ads and everything else. The Democrat message right now is happy warrior. And this is what we can do. And when it comes to the right, everything I get, and maybe it's different for different people, but I've been taking notes. Everything I get is fear-based. Everything I get is about how they're trying to take your job. Like, it's very angry and that what the world is going to turn to hell. Whereas the Democratic message is far more positive at every single level of the ballot of what I get.
Yeah, I'm looking right now to see neither one of them on the main parts of their website say anything about their party. The merch in Sokkin's merch store. Doesn't say a thing about being a Democrat. The color scheme is blue. And over on the Mike Rogers side, I'm seeing the same kind of thing where none of the merch says anything about being a Republican. And I just find that fascinating. But for certain people who need to know that Mike Rogers is a friend of Donald Trump's, they will be told.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be the most, contested race in Michigan because I think that Senate is something that a lot of people don't think about until the very end. It'll be interesting to see how much get out the vote Alyssa Slotkin does down here in Detroit, because if she can get out a lot of Detroiters and kind of ride some possible coattails with Harris, there's some extra votes she can pick up that I think could be very, very useful down here for her, And
it'll be very interesting to see what happens. When I was doing the poll working thing, there were a lot of people who were frustrated because they didn't quite understand that it was a primary and there was no straight ticket voting. A lot of people really like to straight ticket vote.
Mm-hmm.
And when there wasn't one, they found it cumbersome. If Kamala Harris is doing a good job in getting people out and Alyssa Slotkin's doing a good job getting people out, Mike Rogers is going to have a big problem.
Yeah. So before we go, I want to talk about something that just it kind of may crawl a little bit, Steve. And it's from somebody that I believe that we both know. So there's this excellent piece by Anna Clark, who's a longtime qualified journalist. She wrote this piece for ProPublica, a vexing to-do list for Michigan's Gretchen Whitmer. And I thought it was a very fair and balanced piece. I will go ahead, and not in like the fake fair and balanced, like actually fair and balanced. And I'll put a link to it in the show notes for you to check it out. And I don't want to necessarily talk about the content of the piece per se, but the reaction to it, because it reminds me, and I'm seeing this more and more on the social media that I consume, and maybe it's the bubble effect or whatever, but it seems like there is more and more of like a revolt against media and journalism on the left, similar to what I saw on the right in the past. And there's even some data, according to Gallup, that shows giant drops in trust on the left of media. I'll talk about something, whatever, and if the New York Times comes up, say, on Threads, all of a sudden the algorithm will bring in all these people who have never heard about us before to just dunk and do all these things. And I don't necessarily want to talk about the Times per se, because I know you've done some work for them and such, but like, it's this thing where I saw a little bit about it with President Joe Biden and him stepping aside, where it's like, this is how a lot of people feel. Like, this is a legit concern that people are talking about. And then, well, it's just terrible, and it's the elites, and it's the New York Times. And I'm like, I'm old enough to remember Donald Trump talking about the failing New York Times, and I find it deeply ironic that I see so much of the left talking about it and other publications, and others who will reach out to me and say, look, man, I'm fine if local news dies. Like, I'm fine with legacy publications dying. I never heard that on the left before until now, and it's almost jarring for me. I don't know. You're older than me. You've been at this game longer. Maybe I'm just missing something that always happened. What do you think, Steve?
It always has happened. I've been a journalist writing for national publications since the 90s, and there's never been peace. For a long, long time, the big complaint about some of the mainstream media from the left was primarily from the teachers' unions were always very critical of, and also the pro-Israeli Jewish groups were always very critical of the New York Times and a lot of the major newspapers for how they covered their issues. It has intensified to an incredible degree. It was once a thing where, journalists all knew that sometimes you're going to get hit from the right, sometimes you're going to get hit by the left, and if you do, then you're doing something right.
That's generally how I was taught to do it too.
Well, that's true. I'm not dismissing what you're saying, because I do think that the last few years, and particularly just generally speaking, the Trump era, have shown that it's no longer okay to shrug about it. It used to be. The only thing you could do was shrug about it, was say, well, what are you going to do? The information as a journalist that I have to give the public, and if it seems to be skewed one way or the other, well, this is a story. This is a story that I've produced and created with all the right intentions. It's true. No, nobody really believes you anymore. They do. They believe you when they read something that works for them. Mm-hmm. If the polls are showing their candidate up, we're just saying about Joe Biden, there was plenty of reporting by the mainstream media, as well as by the right-wing media, before he got on that debate stage and immolated. There was plenty of reporting about people saying that he wasn't quite up to it, that he seemed a bit out of it, that his age was showing. I'm not even sure that people thought that he couldn't be president or that he wouldn't be effective as a president, but that he didn't have it in him to do the fight that was necessary to win the election. It wasn't really about whether he was competent as a president so much as whether he was going to be able to win this very important election. And there was plenty of that kind of coverage. And when it came up, the folks on the left were vicious. And even some of the folks who later became some of the strongest voices urging Joe Biden to step aside. And I'm thinking the third week in a row we're going to mention them, but the folks from Pod Safe America were the folks who were stepping up when people were claiming that Joe Biden was old and senile and attacking all of that reporting. And then all of a sudden everybody saw what they saw on the debate stage. It could no longer be ignored. And the coverage went the other direction. And the Pod Safe America guys were right in front of the parade all of a sudden saying he needed to get out of the race. And that's just one example of it. You go back to the 2016 election and the left was extremely angry with the media for the coverage of the Hillary email stuff and the different type of scrutiny that was being put on Trump and all of his fallacies and lies and stuff. So, those sorts of episodes don't help. But at the same time, I still think that there's a very, very loud contingent of people online, and then there's the rest of us. And the rest of us aren't as radicalized, aren't as excessively invested in looking deep into a particular story or a particular publication and coming up with some political explanation for what they're reading. Because one of the things that you and I know is most mainstream journalists anyway are trying really hard to give the story the right way. And when there are big mistakes or when there are things that come up that look like they're biased, I almost always think that the more likely answer is incompetence or laziness rather than bias. When you see a reporter who always keeps going back to the same talking heads and getting the same kind of analysis and not trying to dig any deeper than what they're seeing on the television or reading online, I would urge people to consider the possibility that what they think is bias is really just a reporter that was too busy that day or distracted or some other human answer.
I think of Occam's razor, right? The simplest answer is usually the right one. And I think that there has been this discussion of news influencers and, we've got the rise of all these independents in which, we're to a degree, we're an independent as well. I mean, look, I'm chief cook and bottle washer over here. I have no corporate overlords whatsoever. It's our members on Patreon, patreon.com/Daily Detroit. And thank you. It's that idea of trying to get the best story you can. And what I mean by the best story is the story that's right. And I think so many people are working really hard and it's very difficult, 70% of people think that local news is well-funded or mostly well-funded because they go on websites and they see those ads or whatever, but those ads often don't really pay the bills. Most people do not understand the stress that a lot of media and local media is under. I mean, the New York Times is the exception to the rule, frankly, as far as subscriptions and things like that. And I think there's all of this idea that there's all these conspiracies, and I just think it's a whole lot simpler than that. That's my experience. And we've interviewed so many journalists through this podcast, people who I know personally who do excellent work. And it just stuns me when you'll see the response. It's like, did you listen to anything that we said at all? Or did you see the headline, get mad, and then typed a bunch of stuff. And it's one of the reasons why and I think a lot of people have frankly soured on social media in a big way. I've gone back to like newsreaders because I don't really care to get all of that stuff. It's like, okay, I keep up with everybody. I have subscriptions, I think, to 10 different publications at this point. And I'm just like, okay, I don't need all of this like social, because it doesn't add anything to the conversation. I had this huge hope earlier on. I was a huge early Twitter user and all this other stuff. And my hope in like having good discourse online, I hate to say it, has been fading. Discourse is great when it's between emails or in DMs or in our private Discord for the podcast or between us on the air talking. Like, I feel like when the cameras are on in Congress, people act a different way, right? Because the camera's on and I need to show you something about me. And it really like kind of breaks my heart for that. And I had actually kind of had a little bit of hope that maybe some new platforms would be different, but I feel like it just kind of regresses back to the mean. That's just my own personal thoughts.
It's not the platform, it's the people.
Yeah.
Before there was social media, there was all of that poison that was going on in the comments section of newspapers. I remember when it first started, I remember being one of those reporters when I was in my 20s when we started having websites and then we started having comment sections. And at first it was like kind of neat to hear from the public, and people would say that they liked the story or added some thought or some personal experience. And it very, very quickly became a cesspool. It very, very quickly became completely unmanageable for news publications. Nobody even looks at that anymore, really. Maybe on some things, like some entertainment sites where they're, they recap a TV show or something. Sometimes the comments can be interesting because somebody's interesting theory about something that might happen on a certain show. But generally speaking, the minute the general public realized that they could say the worst things with no accountability and no identification, and not only could they say it, but other people would affirm it, and people want to hurt other people, believe it or not. Mm-hmm. It's a genie that's out of a bottle, and it has just metastasized. And I wish that more people would do what you say and get off of these platforms and read the news and find their own balanced way to read things. One of the things I always find so funny, I can't tell you how many people, when you ask them what their media diet is, if they're like real hardcore people and they want to pretend that they're not, they will claim that they listen to the BBC. I'm here to tell you that the BBC does not have a large audience.
It's me. I think I'm the only person.
People, right? It's not happening. And it is disappointing. It's very, very troubling. And I kind of think it's unsolvable. I just don't know. I mean, and you're right. The local media is losing ground, losing subscribers and advertising, and the ability to have enough reporters to really keep people accountable on the local level. And it is really distressing, and most Americans don't realize it. And one of the things that's interesting is when you see those polls about media trust, if I'm not mistaken, I haven't looked in a while, but typically the local TV news gets very, very high trust ratings from the public, better than pretty much any other permutation of the media. And that's just fascinating.
And I used to work in local TV news, okay? And it's the shortest, most boiled down. I don't mean this as a knock, because here's the deal. The format is constraining. I still occasionally do pieces, and your actual word count is very small, right? When you're trying to put together a TV news package in 2 minutes or 3 minutes. Or the last time I did a piece for PBS, the local PBS station, and that's where you have more room. It was 5 minutes, and we shot 3.5 hours of footage. It's just, you know what I mean? It's the most distilled version of all of it.
We live in an increasingly complicated world with a public that is increasingly disinterested in complexity.
That's a word. That's a word, Steve. And it really gets at my heart. It gets at my heart because part of like even the whole mission with Daily Detroit is it's, of course, we're local focus, but like that complexity fascinates me and it's part of how we move better. And that's exactly what's been like the ennui in my soul that I have felt lately.
You and I talked about the idea that certain types of media, like podcasts, are good. They're an encouraging place where people who want more information or want to spend a little bit more time with issues and topics can go. And they do tend to develop relationships with the host in their own head anyway, because they hear it and it's very intimate. They're doing their daily life while they're listening. And that's all good. I think that it has the same problem. You know, some of the most popular podcasts are loudmouth, extreme figures, usually on the right.
Yeah, you look at the top of the charts now. You've got people like Megyn Kelly and Dan Bongino. I'm sorry if I say that wrong. I do not mean to just.
And Tucker and all that.
Yeah. I mean, there's also like Pod Save America, which is also, by the way, although I'm not trying to slam it, it's a biased outlet. Like it says so on the tin. Of course it is. Right? At least I'm glad that they just say it. I much more respect that. Of course, you'll have the Daily and the Up First and all the things like that. But you're absolutely right. It's at that very tippy top has some of those same things. I'm very encouraged by things like the possibilities are available with newsletters and smaller outlets and direct connections with readers and direct connections with listeners. And that's really what I want to foster going forward, because look, like I even look at the data, like you can post on social media all you want, but you're not really going to find your core people there. You're going to find them through other ways when they meet you in person, or through a good Google search or through a podcast app, and they're, hey, I want to learn more about, Metro Detroit or something like that. And then when I look at the newsletter stats, it's even more fascinating. All these things where you'd think that they would be where you gain listeners or gain readers. For us, it's all through the doors that are not social media. And it makes me really evaluate, where do you spend your time and energy? Because the hard part is discovery for everybody, for local news, for bigger places. And there's this idea that you have to go through the platforms. I'm not sure if that's the way to go.
Well, I guess it depends on what you want. Are you looking to make money? Or are you looking to spread ideas? Or are you looking to do a public service? I get the sense that you actually are looking to do a public service. And hopefully keep a roof over your head.
Yeah, the far easier path would be to have just stayed in a corporate communications job and write press releases about new staffing offices in some city in a country or something. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's for the service. I don't like the bad parts of this. Like, I don't like just fighting with people over pointless things. It's more of trying to educate and show ideas, and let's have a forum for this stuff and really try to make a better place. Because otherwise, what's the point? I don't think most people who get into journalism or get into media, there are some people, of course, who do it for themselves. Absolutely. There's always some ego involved. But everybody I've met, that's serious about their work, they want to do really good stuff and they want to share stuff. You know what I mean? They want to do the work.
Back in my day, when I was in college, you went into print media because you were serious and you wanted to write and you wanted to dig in, and you knew that you would never be wealthy. But if you got to a certain place, you could probably make a pretty good living. And certainly it's the most practical way to make a living writing, because all the other types of writing are much, much harder to make a living at. And if you went into television, you wanted to be famous and rich. And at some point, with the rise of cable news in particular, those lines got really blurred. And an awful lot of print journalists are now TV people and make a lot of money doing TV. I don't know what the perspective of a young journalism student is these days. When I was a kid, the career path was small paper, bigger paper, the New York Times. That was sort of the ladder. Now maybe it's Medium, blog, Politico, MSNBC. I don't know what the career path looks like anymore for kids who are going into journalism. The world has changed and the industry has shrunk, and the public is worse off for it, and they may or may not know that.
Well, I would love to hear everyone's thoughts. Big episode today, but I think that people will appreciate it. I think it's really interesting. Steve Freese, I appreciate you. You can write us dailydetroit@gmail.com with your thoughts. That's dailydetroit@gmail.com with your thoughts on any of the topics we talked about. Big episode coming back from a big weekend. I appreciate you, Steve Freese, and we will talk again next week.
Talk to you next week.